Hello, friends, and welcome to 1840, another special episode where we're exploring the war happening in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel. Of course, if you are interested, you can find out more of our work on 1840.org or sign up for our weekly emails. The first time I remember a terrorist attack, I was in 5th grade. I'm pretty sure it was in 1995. I believe I was in Mrs. Shatoff's class, and I still remember the Oklahoma City bombing that was perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh and his partner, Terry Nichols. One of the reasons why I remember it so well is because Newsday ran a program where they asked children in elementary schools to react to what had happened. It was really unfathomable. I mean, I was in 5th grade. I'm sure I was alive, perhaps, for other terrorist attacks. It's the first one I remember. And we spent a day writing about how our lives were going to change following the Oklahoma City bombing. It seems so distant. We were allowed to submit all of our potential, imaginings of how this would impact and affect our lives, and the best ones would get published, I believe, I'm 99% sure, in Newsday, which was a daily newspaper. I'm pretty sure they still publish. And there were two things that I really remember that emerged from this. Number one, a student in my class actually kind of won, I'm using air quotes, I don't know if it's called winning, by sharing reflections after such a terrible, deadly attack. Killed 168 people. Famously, there was a child care center inside of the Alfred P. Murrow Federal Building, which was the subject of the Oklahoma City bombing. And babies were nebuch, lo aleinu, babies were killed. And I remember that one of the students in our class, I believe it was two, but I only remember the name of one person, was actually published in Newsday. And it's not insignificant about who won. The winner in the class, his name is Mati Gottlieb. I believe he's a lawyer in Long Island now. We grew up together. I know for sure that he was one of the responses that were printed because in his kitchen, his mother hung up his response. And it must have been hanging there for at least 5 to 10 years after this took place. I remember seeing it in high school. And Mati Gottlieb's response was fascinating, and I was thinking about it now. He won because he was right. He wrote about the security measures that would now be necessary when traveling on airplanes, when going through security into major areas. He says this is going to affect the movement and how we kind of interact as a society. We're going to be seeing a lot more metal detectors. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that Mati Gottlieb's parents, Ellie and Linda, are both Israeli. And I'm thinking back on it now that we had a whole class and everyone was writing, probably more emotional things. And Mati, probably coming from a home that knew very well about what it means to change security and react to terrorism, kind of gave a very almost logistical, a practical answer. This is going to affect our lives in very real ways. How do I know this? Because my parents grew up with this reality. My parents know this reality firsthand. And I was very struck, and I continue to be struck that kind of this entire 5th grade class in Mrs. Shatoff's class, the one person who really understood the impact of terrorism, even in 5th grade, was the child of Israeli parents, somebody who really understood how war, terrorism really affects the day-to-day life. And the other issue that I was thinking about, reflecting on kind of my first experience with a terrorist attack, which I think for a lot of people, talking to your children, this is definitely a first. My son came home and, he's asking me about the war. He knows something is happening. Obviously, he doesn't have the emotional capacity to really know the horrors of what transpired, but this is going to be a memory for a lot of children of the first time that they were introduced to the horrors of terrorism and of war. And the other thing that I remember, and this is especially given the fact that I don't know that I've done deep research on the Oklahoma City bombing, but there is a recently published a fascinating book by Jeffrey Toobin, somewhat disgraced author from the New Yorker, but he really writes an incredible legal analysis. He's probably most famous for his book on the O.J. Simpson trials, and he wrote a book called Homegrown: Timothy McVeigh and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism. And the reason why I'm thinking about that book and the thing about this incident is Timothy McVeigh was extraordinarily clear about his motivations for the terrorist attack. Yet, again, I was only in 5th grade, but if my memory serves me correctly, the upswelling in the United States of America, certainly in higher education, certainly in society, no respectful person would be seen marching in support of McVeigh's motivations. And he had very real motivations that he detailed, motivations that date back to the standoff at Ruby Ridge, bridge, motivations that date back to the Waco standoff, motivations that date back to what he felt was government overreach, which is why his last words were from the pretty famous William Ernst Henley poem Invictus, where his final words that Timothy McVeigh uttered was, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." He felt he was very justified in committing this terrorist attack. He was very, very cold about it, and he felt he had very real reasons why he would perpetrate such a deadly, horrific attack on American soil. Yet, sadly, so much has changed in the nearly 30 years since that terrorist attack. And it seems you look around and there are people, dignified people, so to speak, people with educations, people in positions of power, people in leadership positions, who their first reaction, their initial reaction and continuing to this day is not one of mourning, not one of horror of the terrorist attack, but one that initially is saying, let's figure out why this happened. Let's figure out the justifications. Let's explore why this was justified. And there's something very painful about living in a time where you can see, so to speak, decent members of society in higher education and positions of power who their first reaction to a terrorist attack is kind of this analysis of the motivations, as if something so horrific, so heinous, can even be justified. And it almost pains me to have the conversation that we are having today, but it is an extraordinarily important conversation, and it's one that we should not be afraid to have, and that is a conversation about morality and war itself. There is this kind of surge in, American thinking. You see it all over the place in op-eds, in essays, in think pieces, that automatically, when there's an act of terrorism, war should be avoided at all costs. And underlying much of this very often is the feeling that there is no way, there is no such thing as morality in times of war. And that is why I think it is so important to really understand, from the viewpoint of a moral philosopher, specifically of war, to understand what goes into the thinking. How do you understand, how do you justify an act of war in response to terrorism? This episode may not be for our listeners, but it may be to equip our listeners with the language to really understand and perhaps explain to people around them who are wondering, who are coming and trying to figure out what is happening, to understand what are the calculations. Is it in fact possible to analyze war through the lens of moral philosophy? And that is why it is such a privilege to speak to somebody who is really instrumental in this line of thinking, and that is Professor Daniel Statman, who happens to be a first cousin to probably my oldest friend, Yoni Statman, who was in that very 5th grade class. I don't believe his response was published. That honor only goes to our friend Mati Gottlieb. But Professor Daniel Statman was involved in something that is really important to highlight today, and that is, aside from being a lecturer, writer in the field of moral philosophy in times of war, he was on the committee that drafted the current IDF Code of Ethics. If you Google, and you can and should Google, Ruach Tzahal in Hebrew, Ruach Tzahal is the code of ethics of the IDF. But it begins, the Ruach Tzahal, the spirit of the IDF, of the military of Israel, Tzava HaHaganah Yisrael Hu Tzava Shel Medina Yisrael. The Israel Defense Forces is the military of the state of Israel. Its actions, and this is directly from the IDF website, its actions are subject to the authority of the democratic civil government of Israel. The purpose of the IDF is to preserve the state of Israel, to protect its independence, and to foil attempts by its enemies to disrupt the normal life within it. The soldiers of the IDF are obligated to fight and devote every effort, even at the risk of their own lives, to protect the state of Israel, its citizens and residents. Soldiers of the IDF shall act according to the values of the IDF and its commands, while abiding to the law, upholding human dignity, and respecting the values of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Our conversation with Professor Daniel Statman explores not only the code of ethics of the IDF, what went into drafting it, why was it drafted, but really explores from first principles, what does it mean to wage a moral war? Does such a thing exist? And I think, especially today when so many are comfortable questioning, when so many are comfortable digging down and thinking, well, what are the underlying issues, and not instead looking at the atrocities that were committed on innocent civilians in the land of Israel, where it seems that openly the moral reasoning of society has deteriorated considerably since I first experienced the news of a terrorist attack almost 30 years ago. I think now is as an appropriate time as ever to explore moral philosophy and war. It is our privilege to introduce our conversation with Professor Daniel Statman. I wanted to begin with a question, a more general question, not even specifically about what we're seeing now before us, about how philosophers think about morality in the context of war. And let me just flesh out the question. Most people can agree that murder is immoral. All of our moral intuitions come to the fore. All of our preconceived notions philosophically come to the fore. And I was curious, in the context of war, a lot of that goes out the window because you're in a situation where you want security. You want to make sure that there is a resolute focus. So help me begin with, how do philosophers think of morality within the context of war?
You laid the problem very nicely, precisely because we have these very strong intuitions against murder, right? Precisely because of that, war becomes very problematic from a moral point of view. We're talking about, killing on a very mass scale, kill thousands of, more human beings. Many of them sometimes are clearly innocent civilians. This is just part of the game. This is what happens in all wars. So the big question is, how can this enterprise at all be morally justified?
Correct. In any context. It's almost a contradiction in terms to talk about morality and war. You have to kind of suspend it. How do you build a bridge to talk about morality within the context of war?
Precisely. And this notion of a just war, people say, you must be joking, this is an oxymoron, a war can't be just. It might be necessary, but it can't be just. Okay, so yeah. So indeed, first of all, some people respond to this big problem by saying that in some way war lies outside the boundaries of morality. Yeah, this view is called moral realism in the context of war.
Moral realism in the context of war,
right.
Meaning you have moral structures of right and wrong, but once a war begins, all bets are off. That's this approach.
Exactly. Now, it's not very easy to defend this approach. One possible defense would be to say that morality gets off the ground only when we have free choices, right?
Interesting.
But when we are at war, this is the realm of necessity. The realm of necessity. We are forced to be there. We are forced to do things we wouldn't do otherwise, in our real life out there. That's why, in some sense, morality doesn't at all apply.
Because it's the suspension of free will. And, both the soldiers and the people involved in a war, they're in a situation that they didn't choose. Nobody decided, oh, what are we doing this morning? Let's go to war. So this approach, which, again, you're calling moral realism, is that we suspend any moral hierarchies or lens in the context of war because there is no free choice, where we are required to be in this situation, so moral judgments don't really apply in this context.
Right. And this follows from a central ethical principle which is ascribed to Kant, which says ought implies can. Okay, ought implies can. So the idea is that it makes sense to speak about what we ought to do or we ought not to do only if we can do what we're talking about.
If you're not forced into it, but if you're forced into a situation, you can't talk about what the ideal should be because this is not an ideal situation to begin with. So ought implies can. That's a very digestible way of thinking about it.
Now, this approach, it is attractive, and you can hear it from people who never studied philosophy. They say things like, don't be a child, we're at war now. And they mean by that, forget about the usual moral constraints, because we're at war and we're kind of a different domain, a different realm. Okay. Now, attractive as this position is, I think it's very hard to really defend it. Because, you think of a soldier or an officer who has to make a decision whether or not to take some course of action which is going to seriously harm civilians or kill many civilians. Now, the officer or the soldier are now contemplating what to do. The very fact that they have this dilemma means that they are not forced to do anything right now. It's up to them. So the decisions of soldiers, officers during war, and obviously the decisions of politicians to go to war, to continue the war, to stop the war, all these are a matter of human decision, human contemplation, and then human decision. So it's really hard to accept this thought that whatever politicians do regarding war and what soldiers do within the war is just kind of forced upon them, okay? I think it's hard to defend more realism. So we're back to square one. I mean, given that wars involve so much killing and destruction and so on, however could they be morally justified, right?
Exactly.
One answer would be, you know what? You're right. They can't. They just can't be justified. And that view is called pacifism.
Pacifism. That's like John Lennon. Imagine all the people.
Exactly.
There'll be no war, this utopian society. Let's all get along. But pacifism to me is also untenable in the face of the horrors of life, the horrors of terrorism, the horrors. You can't get attacked and then turn on. I remember right after the coronavirus started. So the coronavirus was not the product in a more literal sense of, one person attacking another. It was a virus. And there was this response, let's play John Lennon's song, Imagine. Imagine all the people. It's very kumbaya. We'll all be together. There are writers like Kurt Vonnegut who, from the horrors of war, said, let's just try to avoid this, which is a sentiment that I think everybody agrees to, except after you face a terrorist attack. Until after the horrors of life rear its head again, it's impossible to be a pacifist. Pacifism to me feels also morally untenable. No? Like, how would a moral pacifist deal with the moral consequences of pacifism? How can you look at an attack and hostages or whatever it is and advocate, let's be passive, let's kind of relax ourselves, we don't need to respond, we don't need to bring more war, we'll send a goodie basket? How would a pacifist respond to that?
Yeah.
You're not a pacifist, but I'm looking to understand, how do they respond to that very basic charge of like, isn't pacifism morally repugnant?
Okay, so although I'm not a pacifist, pacifism can be presented in a more, charitable way. Okay?
Let's hear.
They're not necessarily kind of lunatics. The first response would be to say something like this. Look, there's some things you're just not allowed to do. Okay? You're not allowed to kill, for instance, an innocent person in order to save your own life or the lives of your children or friends and so on. Okay? This is what we call in the halachic tradition, yihareg velo ya'avor. You just can't do that. If the price is that you're going to die or your friends are going to die, too bad. So if you and your children and your friends all need transplant very, very, urgently, and the only way to get transplant and live is to kill these innocent people and harvest his organs. So you'll have to die. That's life. You just can't do that. So pacifists say that wars involve too much killing of innocent people. You
can't. It's a moral red line.
Exactly. There's an absolute prohibition on taking the lives of innocent people, even if the price is very high.
That's pacifism.
Yeah. The second response of the pacifists is that what they're recommending is not complete passivity. It's not doing nothing. What they call for is non-violent resistance. Now, this might work with some regimes, not with all of them. So probably with the Nazis, it wouldn't have worked. But maybe with other regimes, it would work. Okay, so let's say one thinks that the Israeli occupation in the territories is unjust, okay, and the Palestinians have a right to self-determination and a right to under occupation. So maybe pacifist methods would work vis-a-vis Israel, okay? I'm talking about, strikes, hunger strikes, marches, stuff like that. Okay.
In the States, a lot of the civil rights movement was couched in Martin Luther King Jr. in a non-violent resistance. So they still got arrested. They were still difficult, but they emphasized non-violent resistance. So you've staked out two approaches. One is moral realism. The other is pacifism. Is there a third approach that kind of weds morality with war itself? Because I know you have done work, and correct me if I'm wrong, directly with the IDF and kind of helping them think through some of the moral issues that come up in the context of war. What does a moral philosopher tell an army?
Okay, I'll do that right now, but first I just want to make a distinction between this philosophical discussion and the more educational project of trying to influence the behavior of the army. They might not be the same, okay? What I mean by that is that sometimes we have some philosophical theory which is quite nuanced, and complex. And it might not be smart to walk in a classroom of soldiers or maybe doctors in whatever field and present all these subtleties, especially not, the juniors. Okay, maybe, high-ranked officers or high-ranked doctors, you can show that, let's say for doctors, you want to emphasize, don't harm, don't harm, don't harm. You want to emphasize their complete devotion to their patients and so on and so forth. And with soldiers, we like to emphasize also some things, and we don't want to complicate things too much. Okay.
Correct. They're soldiers, they're not philosophers, so
Yeah.
there are obviously going to be limitations. War in general, soldiers in general, those are not situations and individuals who are renowned for their philosophical nuance. It's nearly impossible.
Right.
You can't give everybody a 20-page philosophical academic paper
Right.
talking about ontology, before war. So yes, I understand we are deliberately talking conceptually right now because I
Right.
want to give
Yeah.
language to even have such a conversation to talk about morality, because this is in the news and people are thinking about it, and help people understand what are some of the concepts that animate, and we should be animating our thought specifically during times of war. So
Yeah.
give me a third approach.
Sure. So the third approach is traditionally called just war theory. So just war theory is a theory about just wars.
When you say just war, you don't mean just war. That's just as the word, the only thing that
No.
we're doing. You mean just as in justified war. A
Absolutely,
war that,
yeah.
that we
Absolutely.
can feel a sense of moral confidence in it being waged. What does
Absolutely.
it mean to have a just war?
Right. So this is a long tradition. If several conditions are met, then the war can be justified. Okay, they're not always satisfied, but if they are satisfied, then the war is morally okay. You can, go home from the war and feel more or less okay with yourself. Politicians can feel okay for taking their nation to a war. Soldiers can feel okay for fighting the war, etc. Okay, so now we need to talk a bit more about these conditions.
Before we get to the conditions, can you give me just a little bit of the history of when this was developed, in what context? Where did the notion of a just war emerge from in the philosophical world?
This starts in Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. Then it was developed by different thinkers, especially in the Christian tradition.
Just war theory predates the world wars. It predates
Yeah,
World
sure.
War I by
Yeah,
many
yeah,
centuries.
yeah.
Were Christian thinkers developing this in the context of the Crusades?
No. It wasn't necessarily in the Crusades. Look, we also have discussions in our own tradition about, what you can do, what you can't do.
Correct.
Different sorts of war, milchemet reshut, and so on, milchemet mitzvah.
What are those conditions that they are looking to be met in order to have that sense of moral clarity and confidence that this is a justified war?
Okay, so first of all, there's this very important distinction between two levels of discussion about the morality of war. Okay, one level is what they call in Latin jus ad bellum, which concerns the very launching of war, the very going to war. And the other is jus in bello, which concerns the way wars are fought.
So one is starting the war. That's again in Latin, because I love a little bit of Latin. Starting the war is
Jus or jus ad bellum,
and the latter is called
jus in bello.
and that's the tactics used within a war.
One concerns the justice of going to war,
Yeah.
and the other the justice of fighting the war.
Okay.
If you wish, you can say that in jus ad bellum, talking of the adjective, the war itself is just or unjust. In bello is an adverb. The war is fought justly or unjustly.
Okay, very good.
Okay, so according to the traditional understanding, these two levels are logically independent. So a country might go on a war justifiably, okay, let's say because the country is unjustly attacked by its neighbor, okay, it's clearly a war of self-defense.
So it's jus ad bellum, but then the way they wage the war could still
Exactly.
be unjustified.
Right, so let's say they target civilians and so on. And the other way around, a country might go to war which is unjust, but then fight it like gentlemen, by the book, okay?
Gotcha.
These are supposed to be separate dimensions. So concerning jus ad bellum, the thought is that if it's a war of self-defense, if your country is attacked, then you have a right to defend yourself. So you're not allowed to go to war for some religious cause or to expand your territory or enrich your country and so on, but you are allowed to go to war to block an unjust attack against you. So that's the ad bellum. The in bello concerns, as we said, the way you fight. And here there are several principles. The main principle is the principle of discrimination. That's how it usually referred to, the principle of discrimination, which requires maintaining a clear distinction between combatants and non-combatants. That's the most important principle. So when it concerns combatants, you have a sweeping permission to kill all of them. There are some exceptions, ambulances or, maybe hospitals and so on. But in principle, you have a right to kill all of the soldiers of the other side, okay? But regarding non-combatants, there's a sweeping prohibition to kill any of them.
My difficulty with that is, in older wars, you read about the Civil War, you read about the Revolutionary War, you read about World War I, World War II. There was really a front of two armies. Everyone wore a very specific uniform, and they were taking place, not always, but most commonly on battlegrounds that were not embedded inside of populations. Is there any way that moral philosophers kind of like update or think about how do you wage a war when the combatants are so embedded within a civilian population, especially that's in the context now? Does that automatically require that a moral philosopher of war is going to say, well, that now makes it impossible? You may have had a justification to go, but there's no way to do this justly? Or is there a way to, even with the difficulty and knowing that, look, we need victory, we need to solve this, we need security for our civilians, and this becomes very difficult because to discriminate in such a densely populated civilian area, you imagine, God forbid, if there were terrorists hiding out in skyscrapers in New York City, it would be impossible, but you need to resolve this. So how does a moral philosopher think about morality when the combatants are so indiscriminate among the civilian population?
Okay, so this has to do with a second principle. So the first principle was you're never allowed to target civilians. But we should be more accurate. You're never allowed to target civilians directly or intentionally. Mm-hmm. You are, however, allowed, you have a right to harm civilians indirectly or collaterally. You can do that. Collaterally, killing civilians is okay, provided that the harm to civilians is proportionate to the military value of the attack. So let's say there is this remote post of your enemy, which isn't that important, but it is a legitimate military attack. But attacking it, you can foresee that it will probably bring about the death of, 50 civilians. So that seems disproportionate. If, however, you're attacking your enemy's headquarters, then 50, maybe 100, maybe 200 dead civilians might seem okay, all right? So the principle is not that you can never bring about the death of civilians. That's not the principle. The principle is that you can never do that intentionally. So what we see in recent wars, at least fought by more or less decent armies, they never attack civilians directly. They do attack military targets. Military targets can be enemy combatants, can be places where they hide rockets, whatever, knowing that there's a good chance that enemy civilians would be harmed.
I really have two questions just to rewind, just to understand, because it's such a fascinating area of philosophy, and it's a subcategory. It's a subcategory of philosophy, which is moral philosophy, and a subcategory of moral philosophy, which is the moral philosophy of war, which I can't imagine is a massive community. My first question is, you had mentioned Thomas Aquinas. I'm curious what compelled the founding of this area of thought. What were they responding to that they said, you know what, we need to kind of figure out these principles? Was it the horrors of other armies that propelled certain moral philosophers to think about this? What was going on in the world? What were they coming to respond to that they developed this area of philosophy?
To be honest, I don't know enough about the history of just war theory. I would just say that for me, it sounds perfectly logical that societies from maybe the beginning of history saw the advantage of keeping some kind of separation between the battlefield and the civilian population, okay? Mm-hmm. In some places, there was total war, where in the end of war, everybody is either massacred or sold, to be slaves. But in other places, people saw the advantage of having some kind of rule to regulate this activity, which would allow, on the one hand, some kind of effective self-defense, while on the other would use the horrors of war.
I imagine there are conferences that have professors from around the world involved in, the moral philosophy of war. Predominantly in the the field, is there any, not even consensus, but are there trends? I would imagine that most people who dedicate their life to teaching philosophy in a higher education do not feel a kinship with the idea of just war theory. My guess, of the little I know about higher education, is that they tend more to pacifism, or war is not something that professors in general have ever championed. So I'm curious to hear a little bit inside the field of this, subcategory of moral philosophy. And secondly, I'm very curious about, if you've gone to conferences, you're affiliated with an Israeli university, do you find yourself constantly having to kind of, so to speak, defend? Do you have like an outside voice when you're at these conferences trying to present or give some language or understanding of Israel's role vis-a-vis the larger world, where specifically in higher education we're seeing now so many professors in higher education have deep misgivings at best, and sometimes at worst really outright condemnation of Israel. So I'm curious about how you balance your role as a moral philosopher focused on war in Israel, and how does that play out, Israel's role in the larger moral philosophy community, and specifically your role, when you go to conferences. How do people treat you? There must be people from countries that are less sympathetic or outright hostile to Israel. So I'm curious about kind of your personal role in all of this.
Yeah, this is a nice question. It's interesting the way you perceive your assumptions about the academic community, the philosophical community that does war. Your sense is that most of them would be kind of pacifist or tend to pacifism.
That would be my guess. And it could be influenced from American universities.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This is completely not the case. It's not the case. I think it might be the case with non-philosophers, maybe. But philosophers, especially philosophers who do war, there are very few pacifists, very few. So most people are just war theorists, basically. The big question is how to justify these principles we talked about briefly before. So there's a lot about that, how to justify these principles. The second question here, I think when I started working in the field, I was sure that just exactly the way you thought, that I'll be in kind of inconvenient, situations in academic conferences. Well, not at all. Maybe it happened here and there, but generally speaking, that's not at all the feeling I have when I go to these conferences. Maybe it has to do with the fact that we are quite a lot of Israelis in the field.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it's a very friendly community. I never felt a sense of hostility against me as an Israeli or as a Jew. Maybe I shouldn't say never, but definitely it's not something, was never anything significant, It's also true that maybe because sometimes I fear that, so in my writings in the field, I rarely bring examples from Israel. Okay?
Okay, that's fair.
I'm not looking for trouble, but I think I could have,
That's very fair. So I saw that you have worked directly with the IDF. You clarified you're not talking to young soldiers, but you're in communication, and you worked out some ethical handbook or some principles for the IDF. Can you tell me a little bit about what that work was and how it came about?
We're talking about the ethical code of the IDF.
Yes.
The official name in Hebrew is Ruach Tzahal, the spirit of the IDF. That's the official name.
Ruach Tzahal.
Yeah, Ruach Tzahal. Now, the first version of this document was authored by Professor Asa Kasher, who was a professor of philosophy at Tel Aviv University. He offered the army to go this direction and try to write this ethical code, and he proposed his version of it, and the chief of staff then, Ehud Barak, okayed it. That was in 1995. When the chief of staff okayed it, then it was agreed that they'll see in 5 years or so, they'll maybe look at it again. Following the attempts to implement it in the army, they'll see whether they need to revise things and so on.
How long is this? Is this a whole book that every soldier's getting?
No. You can find it at the IDF site. It's just a one-page document.
Okay, I'm looking it up right now. Okay, Ruach Tzahal. It's got its own Wikipedia page, in Hebrew at least.
Yeah. And then in 2000, there was a new, what they call the chief education officer of the army, Elazar Stern, and he thought that the document needs some revision.
Why? Were there specific issues he had with the document?
He had all kinds of issues. For instance, he thought that we should include there the values of Ahavat Haaretz, love of the country, Ahavat Ha'am, love of the people, and other things. He thought it wasn't Jewish enough. He had some other concerns. I don't remember them right now. So he set up this committee, which had a bunch of moral philosophers, basically. So it was myself, Moshe Halbertal, whom you might know.
Sure.
Yeah, and there was Avi Sagi, me and my colleague from Haifa, Sol Smilansky, and Noam Zohar from Bar Ilan. So we were a bunch of 6-7 philosophers, and we worked on this document for maybe a year or so.
And it's not a long document. You spent a whole year basically refining the right language.
Right, yeah. Look, we didn't meet once a week. We were all
You didn't
busy,
take a sabbatical to do this.
Exactly, yeah.
There was this push to have more about Avas Ha'aretz and Avas Ha'am. How did you guys emerge on some of those questions, and how does your version differ from the previous version?
Okay, so first of all, it's shorter. We simplified what we thought was kind of complicated language to high language, because we saw the document made as an education document that should be kind of on a poster in every office in the army.
Correct. It's not an intro to philosophy course.
Exactly.
It's supposed to ground your values, like a value statement.
Yeah, it's like, in the Marines, they have duty. What's the other two? Do you remember them?
No.
Duty and honor, and something like that.
Yeah.
That's the idea. We wanted these simple ideas, simple notions that can be taught at all levels in the army. And then we changed the structure, and we added 3 what we called Erchei Yesod, basic values. The first version just had a list of 10 or 11 values. We have now 3 fundamental values. Now, what's very important morally is that one of these values is human dignity. Okay, so human dignity is a basic value for the IDF. Okay, this is very significant. So, soldiers and officers are taught in every stage of their education and training that, it's very, Kvod Adam is very important. The other significant change had to do with what the value called purity of arms. Tohar HaNeshek, purity of arms.
What does that mean?
So that's really the kind of in bello principle. It's about distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. Mm-hmm. Now, according to the previous version, the basic principles, and that's Asa Kasher's view, it's a legitimate view, we think it's completely wrong and problematic. But on his view, the basic principle is not the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, but that between necessary and unnecessary attacks. Mm-hmm. So according to the old version, if an attack is unnecessary, then it's ruled out. If it is necessary, then it's okay. Now, for us, this is very problematic, because you can deduce from that if you think that targeting civilians is necessary, then that's okay. But that's, of course, illegal and unethical by almost everybody. Okay. On the other hand, to say that you're allowed to attack enemy combatants only if that's necessary is an incredible and impossible burden on soldiers. How could I know?
Correct.
Okay. That's why on our version, the distinction isn't between necessary and unnecessary harm, but between combatants and non-combatants. You are never allowed to intentionally, directly attack civilians. You are allowed to attack all combatants, though we added there that even when you attack combatants, it would be nice lishmor al tzelem enosh, to maintain some kind of dignity,
You are shooting to kill. You are trying to kill these people. I know what it looks like when a combatant is killed, and God forbid, we see with victims, and you see in certain armies, they'll trash the bodies, they'll do disgusting things. I can't even say it to our audience. It's so disturbing. But in your mind, what do you think is the proper way even when you are fighting to kill, to murder the combatants? How can you be, again, in the Hebrew verse, to be shomer, to guard, to have some notion of that humanity? In your mind, what is the implication of that? What are you hoping? You're not hoping that they shoot with, with hugs. You know they have guns. Sure. We are trying to have victory and to kill them. So what is that either excluding, or what is that, proactively including to ensure that remains an operative principle, even as you are shooting in war to kill and secure your borders and your territory?
The challenge, ethically speaking, is to remember all the time that there are real human beings on the other side. And that's tough to remember that once you're at war. Right, and you have this very wide permission to kill all combatants and to bring about collateral harm. Okay, so the way to remind yourself that there are real human beings over there is not to exploit all the permissions you have. So sometimes you have a right to attack some military attack, but maybe avoid doing that because there's harm to civilians. Now the harm might be okay, might be proportionate. You're allowed to do it, but maybe you can refrain from doing that. Or let's say you're already winning the war, you're clearly winning the war, and the enemy troops are escaping. So you have a right to kill them because you're still officially at war. The enemy hasn't surrendered yet, But still, there's something disturbing about, going on shooting at the enemy, even though the threat isn't significant anymore. It's just examples where you can maintain your tzelem enosh or tzelem Elohim just by constantly reminding yourself that there are real human beings at the other side.
It's interesting because the way you articulate it, I don't know if it's deliberate, it's maybe just as much or perhaps even more to protect the human dignity of the soldiers than the combatants that they're fighting against. That, like, in the intensity of battle, it's so easy for someone to kind of descend into kind of that nihilistic world, that first position that you presented, and just to have some reminder to almost preserve your own humanity as a soldier, which is something I can definitely understand. So you made these revisions. Were they immediately accepted? Did you get a lot of pushback?
Yeah, this was accepted by the chief of staff those days, Shaul Mofaz, and this since has been the official code of ethics of the IDF. So every soldier gets it in his first training, the Tironut, and then if they're officers, they get it later. So now we created a language, which is very important. Okay, so the officer can say, we can't do that because, Torah Neshek, we can't do that, Kvod Adam, we can't do that because discipline, Mishmat, and so on. That's, I think, powerful. So for me, this document, as I said earlier, is an educational one. It's not a philosophical one. And whether it is successful will be tested by the actual effect it has on how our soldiers fight their wars.
Most people are outraged. There's a great deal of anger in the community. Even having a conversation, honestly, about morality can seem misplaced. It could seem too sympathetic to even have the conversation. But I know your work, and I know the army knows your work. You're not, God forbid, undermining the important work of the Israeli army. But I am wondering, for you as an individual, as a moral philosopher, when you heard and you saw the images that have been circulating, take me through how you, as a moral philosopher of war, living in Israel, being exposed to the ugliest, most just outrageous, horrific acts that we've been exposed to. Take me through your initial reaction, and I'm just curious where you are now as a thinker, as a philosopher, just myself. There's always a concern. Israel is being criticized very publicly by so many who always look for reasons to criticize Israel, and that's not at all, God forbid, what I'm looking for now. I want to kind of hear the interiority of what goes through your mind as a moral philosopher of war, hearing the horrors unfold and kind of getting to the point where we are now, where we're looking that, we're likely going to go to this war right now. So maybe you could open up and kind of share with me on that personal level how you process this.
Of course, on the personal level, I had the same feeling, I guess, that most Jews in the world had strong feelings of revenge. We must get back at the bastards, let's get back at them, and so on. But I think I never for a second really thought that what the army should do or what Israel should do is just, carpet bomb, Gaza, or throw some tactical atomic weapon or something like that, just wipe out Gaza. I think I never had anything of that kind of thought in my mind. I did think, and I do think, that, and this follows what we talked earlier, that Israel has there was never a clearer right of self-defense against Hamas. So Israel is fully justified in attacking Hamas bases, headquarters, tunnels, offices, and so on and so forth. And if these are located within residential areas, too bad. This goes under the collateral harm permission, okay? So that's definitely what I did have in mind. So I foresaw that this is what we're going to see. We won't see, and thank God we didn't see, carpet attacking or bombing of Gaza. If that were the case, we would see, tens of thousands of casualties within an hour. We did see in the last week, and we'll see this, I guess, in the next week or so, attacks on legitimate targets, places where they launch rockets from and so on, with many civilian casualties living nearby. So that's concerning what's going on in Gaza right now. What's very scary and threatening and, right now with great uncertainty is the northern border. If God forbid, Hezbollah joins the party and uses the thousands or, tens of thousands of missiles and rockets they have, including accurate missiles that can get to any point in Israel, that would be a completely different game. just because there will be no way that Israel could handle all this using or abiding by the regular rules of war. It would be just impossible. With Gaza, it's more or less impossible, although it's impossible in Gaza because we use a kind of a wide understanding of proportionality.
Sure.
Okay, we say, look, we realize we are attacking only an office of Hamas or I don't know what, and there are going to be many civilians nearby, but, there's no other way to do it. So we use a broad understanding of proportionality. With Hezbollah, I'm not sure we can even do that. Okay, so I don't know. It's going to be hell. It's going to be hell, and Israel might have to do things that Israel would never do that in Gaza or other places. You can hear these kind of explicit threats by chief of staff in the last day or so, by prime minister, saying things like, we'll destroy the Hezbollah and so on. They don't only mean destroy the training camps of Hezbollah.
There's definitely a lot of uncertainty, and our continued tefillos are with you and Amcha Yisrael and all of what is unfolding. One of the things you said is the danger of going to war just for religious reasons. And I'm curious, there are academic institutions that are affiliated with Arab nations, maybe not Gaza or on the West Bank. And I'm curious if you have any relationships with the kind of the parallel moral philosopher thinker and whether or not you ever speak or have these conversations. And secondly, I'm curious, how do you deal with your own religiosity, which you said from a pure philosophical standpoint should not be the reason that is animating a war, but it's hard to extricate the Amcha Yisrael component that, defending the Jewish people across the board. So I'm curious kind of, your own religious national identity, how you deal with that, how you think about that specifically in war, because it can foment very intense feelings that maybe from a purely philosophical point of view cannot be justified.
Yeah, so I think I've been a philosopher too many years. In a way, I kind of zoom out when I think about these issues and I think about them philosophically. For instance, as I said a minute ago, like everybody, I had this very powerful, rage and desire for revenge when I heard about the atrocities on Simchat Torah. But then I kind of immediately start to think about this philosophically. Now, I'm always inspired by our Mekorot, our sources, and often find their support for my philosophical views. I'm probably going to write an op-ed with a friend with a nice midrash about Avraham and Sodom, which is actually very interesting, and I never thought of it. It was his idea. When you look at the dialogue between Avraham and God regarding Sodom, God really concedes that in spite of the fact that Sodom and Amorah are the worst cities, full of sinners, the worst sinners, we won't touch them if the collateral harm to the tzaddikim is too high. How much is too high? 50, 40,
40, 50.
We can negotiate that. But there is kind of an implicit usage here of the very notion of proportionality. Even if your enemy is as wicked, as evil as Sodom and Amorah, you can't just wipe them out with no concern to the innocent. So that's very telling. That's very interesting. So if you take this reading of Bereshit, then this idea of proportionality, of restraint, in battle, isn't kind of an Asian of Western morality. We have it in Bereshit.
Fascinating. And just tell me, is there a Professor Daniel Statman parallel?
To be honest, I don't think so. I've been in the field of ethics of war for quite a lot of time. I've met one or two Muslim philosophers, but from the US, so they're Americanized. I think that philosophy in general is not very strong in Arab countries. It's mostly, I think, theology. So no. And when you look at the literature, there's, I think, 0 publications, definitely in serious journals, by Arab philosophers. So I have no idea what's going there. I think they're not part of the philosophical discourse at all.
I did a PhD in public policy, and my focus was on crisis management and crisis communications. And there are an overwhelming amount of Israelis who write on this topic. And it's heartening and saddening at the same time of the topics that draw in different populations and what they need to think about. And I'm hoping really on behalf of all of Amcha Yisrael and the Jewish people and all the people in the land of Israel that your work should be purely theoretical. We should never have to apply it, and we should see that in our lifetime. I always end my interviews with more rapid-fire questions. My first question is, if somebody wants a good introductory book that helps you think about issues of morality, specifically as it relates to times of war, are there any introductory books that you would recommend? Obviously, if you can, a book in English. For people to understand these issues better, what would you recommend?
So I think the best book is still the classic book by Michael Walzer, Just and Unjust Wars.
Michael Walter, Just and Unjust Wars.
Michael Walzer, yeah.
Walzer, okay.
Yeah. The second book, that would be a piece of arrogance or a vanity, it would be to refer to my book with my colleague and friend Yitzhak Ben Baji. The book is called War by Agreement.
War by Agreement.
Yeah.
And that's in English.
That's definitely in English, but both of them, of course, in English. In this book, we present the most widespread view of wars today. We argue against it, and we present our own view.
If somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical with no responsibilities whatsoever to go back to school, you never really left, and get a PhD in a different field, what field of study do you think you would choose?
I would like to say law, but law is too close to what I do in any case. So I would say history.
Any specific area of history that fascinates you?
I would say modern history.
Modern history. Okay, still broad, but I'll let you off the hook. It's a difficult time, so I'll let you off. My last question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
On average, I go to sleep around 10:30. Right now, because I'm so anxious about the war and so on, I wake up at 4:30. Usually, it would be around 5:30, 6 o'clock.
Dr. Professor Daniel Statman, thank you so much for joining me today, and our continued tefillos to you, your family, and Amcha Yisroel. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
It's never an easy time to kind of confront these questions, but I think especially those who defend Amcha Yisrael, Be'eretz Yisrael, the Jewish people in the land of Israel, now is the time where we need to be educated and have the language to really understand the nature of war and particularly how war interacts with morality. You may not like his politics or his policies, but it is actually worth revisiting the remarks of President Obama when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. Hauntingly enough, he accepted them in Oslo, Norway, which was also the place where the secret negotiations that began the Oslo Accords took place. And it is worth revisiting what he spoke about. As cringe, I think there were a lot of people who cringed when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize so early in his tenure as president. I think even he made reference to some of the controversy that surrounded his acceptance. But when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, he did something very unusual, and that was surfacing the fact that for whatever efforts he did to promoting peace, he is also the commander-in-chief of the military of a nation in the midst of two wars. And he used the remainder of his speech to really outline the necessity and why war, specifically a just war, is so important to maintaining society and civilization.
I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. For make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. A nonviolent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies. Negotiations cannot convince al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. To say that force may sometimes be necessary is not a call to cynicism, it is a recognition of history, the imperfections of man, and the limits of reason. I raise this point. I begin with this point because in many countries there is a deep ambivalence about military action today, no matter what the cause. And at times this is joined by a reflexive suspicion of America, the world's sole military superpower. Yet the world must remember that it was not simply international institutions, not just treaties and declarations, that brought stability to a post-World War II world. Whatever mistakes we have made, the plain fact is this: the United States of America has helped underwrite global security for more than 6 decades with the blood of our citizens and the strength of our arms. The service and sacrifice of our men and women in uniform has promoted peace and prosperity from Germany to Korea and enabled democracy to take hold in places like the Balkans. We have borne this burden not because we seek to impose our will. We have done so out of enlightened self-interest, because we seek a better future for our children and grandchildren, and we believe that their lives will be better if others' children and grandchildren can live in freedom and prosperity.
And this notion was echoed in many ways by a fantastic article that was published by Rabbi Dr. Dov Lerner, a colleague of mine at Yeshiva University, where he wrote for the Layer House an article entitled "War is a Very Ugly Thing, but Not the Ugliest." And he quotes something really remarkable from John Stuart Mill that I'd like to share with you, where John Stuart Mill said, "War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling, which thinks nothing worth a war is worse." I just want to read that again because I think it's so powerful. War is an ugly thing, but not the ugliest of things. The decayed and degraded state of moral and patriotic feeling, which thinks nothing worth a war is worse. And as long as justice and injustice have not terminated their ever-renewing fight for ascendancy in the affairs of humankind, human beings must be willing, when need is, to do battle for one against the other. And Rabbi Lerner writes, "Evil can be banal because goodness needs to be taught. Cruelty can be casual, inhumanity can become natural, and what we see as unfathomable and incomprehensible can come to pass if we do not do our part to instill human hearts with compassion." And he goes on to quote Ronald Reagan, who said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. And if you and I don't do this, then you and I may well spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free." As painful as this period may be, as difficult as it may be, we need to remember that war is very ugly, but not the ugliest. And find a way that collectively, together, we don't just know the details of the war, but more importantly, remind ourselves what we're fighting for. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our incredible friend Dina Emerson. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 516-519-3308. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word FORTY.org, 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.
Shomer Yisrael Shemor She'eretz Yisrael V'yal Yovad Yisrael Omrim Shema Yisrael Shomer Yisrael Shemor She'eretz Yisrael